Okay, so this will be the lecture for the first part of Exodus, the story of Israel's enslavement and liberation from Egypt. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill our minds with the light of your truth. Fill our hearts with the fire of your love. Move us from where we are. Change us from who we are. Guide us to where you want us to be. And transform us into your likeness. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so here I am. I'm on my back porch here, my little balcony at my house. It's a Sunday, and we'll be going through the first half of Exodus, and we got a lot to get to, so might as well get started. All right, so just a few words about the book itself. The book of Exodus is the second book of Moses, the second book in the Bible. Remember, there are 5 books of Moses, 5 books of the law, which together are called the Torah or the Pentateuch. And Torah basically is the Hebrew word for law. More accurately, it means instruction. And this is the second of those 5 books. And like much of Genesis, it is structured according to a story, a narrative. But with the book of Exodus, we begin to see interspersed with that narrative a lot of instructions, detailed instructions, a lot of what will come to be known as mitzvot, or laws, instructions, laws that the Israelite community would turn to order their way of life. So we're really beginning to see in earnest in Exodus some of the laws that appear in the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, the title Exodus comes from the Greek, which just means going out. It's you might even think of it as an escape, a departure. That word comes from the Greek. You could tell it means out because the prefix X means out of, and it's a story of departure from slavery, departure from Egypt. The Hebrew title is a little more intriguing. The Hebrew word for this book is Shemot, which means names. Now, why would this book be called Names? It's right from the first verse there. These are the names of the sons of Israel. And then are listed the people that ended up going down to Egypt. Now, there's a broader, deeper way you could look at this title. Significance might come into greater relief if we think about what it means to name something. If you see someone out there in the distance, in the dark or the fog, you might know that someone's out there, but you don't know who, you don't know what. What difference does it make to be able to say, oh, that's Joe, or oh, that's Dad out there? Or if you come across a species of animal, you don't know what it is. Once you learn the name of it, it begins to take on a more definite shape. If it doesn't have a name yet, say it's an undiscovered species, by naming it, you in a sense give it a place within your whole way of construing and ordering and cataloging the things in the natural world. To name things is the way we really begin to make sense of the world around us. It's a first preliminary step of thought, to have names, to have words for things. You see this with little children. They'll point to something, and then you teach them the name of that something, and then they begin to use that word to refer to the thing, and their mode of thought begins to emerge from that process. So, this book of names is really the place where Israel begins to make sense of its world. It begins to assign names to the things that are most significant to it. The names of Israel's sons, which are right there at the beginning of the first chapter. These sons are, of course, Abraham's great-grandchildren. These are the descendants that are the recipients of the promise God made to Abraham. You learn the name of the people, the Israelites. Now you may think, oh, well, haven't we run across that before? And it is true that about 6 times in Genesis, the word Israelite is used. to refer to the group of people that are descended from Abraham, and specifically from Jacob, whose name is Israel, hence Israelites. But in Exodus, the word appears over 100 times. I think the word count that I just looked up was 116 times. So compare 6 times in the book of Genesis, which is a big book. And then in Exodus, all of a sudden, this word becomes very commonly used to refer to the people there. They take on this name in a new way. It's the name of the people, the name of the nation, and it's really where this name comes into its own, you might say. The name of the people, the Israelites, really appears in Exodus for the first time, and we learn the name of the leader of the Israelites, Moses. Now, he's not only the leader in this book, he will be looked back upon as the leader or the prophet, the chosen one of the covenant that God establishes with them. He is the one to whom God gives the law, and his name has significance too. His name, as we'll see, means drawn from the water, and it names in a way the defining experience that makes the Israelites a people. Their deliverance from the waters of the Red Sea, which again comes to kind of reflect their whole experience of being delivered from the chaos and slavery of Egypt. So Moses' name is sort of like a window into the meaning of the whole experience, to be drawn from the water. Perhaps most significantly, we learn the name of God. The name is kind of best transliterated with the Roman letters YHWH. Some have pronounced that Yahweh, some Yehovah, some Jehovah. And we'll learn in Exodus 3 that its basic meaning is that I am who am. That's the name that God gives himself. That's the closest kind of etymological meaning that you could give to this name. We don't know how it's pronounced because the Israelite people come to reverence it to the point where they don't even pronounce it anymore for fear of blaspheming, for fear of misusing the name. So we learn God's name. Now, connect that back to my remarks earlier. If there's a God out there somewhere, you know that it exists, it's a thing, but you don't exactly know what to call it. You don't know how to refer to it. It doesn't yet have a place in your thought world. To give this God a name is a significant act. It assigns, in a sense, a place, a title to this reality, establishes a relationship to human thought, to the community's way of life, to name God. It's really the point at which God ceases to become either that thing or that guy, but a specific person with a specific personality, specific will. The name of Egypt is also significant. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which means straits. And it, of course, gets that name because Egypt is a very narrow country. It's kind of huddled around the Nile River. That's really the only place in that part of the world where there was significant water enough to have a civilization. And to be in straits means to sort of be hemmed in. And the Egyptian kingdom was hemmed in by the Nile. Now, of course, the Nile Delta kind of expands out, but it's significant that Egypt is assigned this name, which is associated with bondage, with limitation, with the narrowing of possibilities. So Egypt is a place where you are kind of enclosed, hemmed in. All right. Now, the structure of the book, I liked this part of the Bible Project overview video. It really has 2 main parts with a section in the middle that holds them together. We're going to be looking over those first 18 chapters today, and maybe just the first 15 really. But those first 18 chapters tell the story of Abraham's descendants living in Israel, becoming enslaved in Israel, and then finding their way out through God's power, being liberated from slavery in Egypt. And they're on their way then to the promised land. So they're on their way and they stop for quite a bit of time at this mountain. And this is chapter 19. And here's really where they encounter God. This is where God gives them the law, the 10 Commandments, and where Moses receives all the instructions that he's then to pass on to the people. So from that point on, we get a lot of laws, we get a lot of plans for the practices, the feasts, for this building, the tabernacle, very significant part of Exodus, as we'll see in next lecture, where they are to worship God, where God's presence will be located or concentrated. But the first 18 chapters is pretty much a straight story. There is one significant section in there where they lay out the details for the Passover meal. But other than that, it's pretty much just telling the story of Israel in Egypt, their plight, the story of Moses, how God intervenes to bring them out of Egypt and to this mountain where God will meet them and will give Moses the law. And that's chapter 19. And then chapters 20 through 40 is mostly laws, mostly instructions for how the people are to live and what they're supposed to do. Okay, so let's get into the story. So right in chapter 1 there, we have a change in the situation that Israel finds itself in at the end of Exodus. And it's worth noting that the beginning of Exodus is very much tied into the end of Genesis. So it's really just continuing that story of Genesis from where it left off. And where it left off was that Jacob and his family moved down to Egypt because of Joseph and his position there, and they're treated well. They settle down in that place called Goshen. But then, as we see in verse 8, chapter 1, a new king comes into power who knew nothing of Joseph and rose to power in Egypt. Now, the running theory, the most prominent theory now is that there was a change in the whole people or tribe that was running Egypt. There was this group of Semitic nomads who for a brief period of time took over Egypt. They're called the Hyksos, Hyksos. And they came traditionally from the land of Canaan. And many people think it was under the Hyksos that Joseph came into power. Then with Thutmose, I believe it was Thutmose the first, he reestablished the sovereignty of Egypt from the original dynastic line. So you had a period of decline in Egypt. This is when the Israelites come to settle. Then you have another coup, and a king is in power who really has nothing to owe and maybe even no knowledge of Joseph. So Joseph's out of the picture. Now, without this person in a position of power to shield and privilege the Israelites, eventually they descend into oppression. And it's really fueled, as it says in chapter 1, by a sense of fear. So the Pharaoh at the time, notice we don't know the Pharaoh's name. We'll get to that a little bit later. We know the names of all these other people and things, but we don't know who this Pharaoh was. It just says Pharaoh. This Pharaoh was fearful of the Israelites because, as he says, they may become more numerous than we are. And so they may turn against us, particularly in a time of war. We have this large group of people that are not ethnic Egyptians, and they're growing faster than we are. And he was afraid that they would become more numerous and that they might be turned against the Egyptians and that the Egyptian dynasty might be overthrown yet again. The source of this fear might be related to the fact that the Egyptian monarchy was toppled once before, which allowed the Israelites to come into the land. Okay, this fear eventually bears fruit in oppression and violence. So first, they set supervisors over the Israelites, so they really try to take control of the community. I like to think of maybe like setting up a surveillance state or something like that to keep tight control, close tabs on the Israelites. And this form of control eventually leads to slavery. The Egyptians reduced the Israelites to cruel slavery, as it says in verse 13 there. What does this slavery involve? Well, hard labor, mortar and brick, and all kinds of field work, it says. Now, I underline mortar and brick there because it's interesting to look back, say, on the Tower of Babel through the lens of this experience of having to work as slaves, particularly making bricks for the Egyptian structures, for their cities. Who knows, maybe for the pyramids even. We don't really know exactly what they built. They built 2 store cities, it says, Pithom and Ramses. But how does that relate back to Babel? And you might remember that things go wrong in the Babel story when the people invent the brick. It kind of makes a little more sense if people who had been enslaved making bricks for generation after generation would look and say, well, where might things have gone wrong? Maybe it was the very invention of the brick that began the corruption of humanity, or at least the corruption of human society in general. But the Israelites respond to this slavery, and they hang in there, and they actually keep growing. So that was the whole reason that the Egyptians wanted to tighten the reins on the Israelites and eventually suppress them, was to limit their numbers, but their numbers were not limited. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And so drastic measures were taken in the form of genocide. First, there's a state-sponsored infanticide program where midwives are hired by the Egyptian regime to immediately kill any male children as soon as they're born. And the reason for this is that the identity of the people in the culture was handed down through the male line. Daughters and women could join other families and tribes and be assimilated, be absorbed into the Egyptian culture. So to kill the males is really to cut off the continuity of the people's identity. So that's why they were especially targeting the males. Now there were these 2 midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who were told to kill the male children, but they feared God. And this is meant to be the explanation for why they didn't follow through with their instructions, with their orders. They let the boys live. And when they were asked, well, why are there still all of these boys being born? They said, the Egyptian women are so strong that by the time we get there to do the deed, they've already delivered, they've already found out it was a boy, and so there's nothing that we can do. Now, really, they were fearing God. They didn't want to kill the male children. And so it says on 2 occasions that God rewards them. God dealt well with the midwives. God built up families for them. And notice these 2 lowly midwives taken from among the Hebrews are named. So we know who they are. Shiphrah, Puah. We don't know Pharaoh's name. It just seems a kind of a significant omission, doesn't it? But we know the names of these 2 midwives because they feared God and they stood between the genocidal program of Pharaoh and these poor children that were the targets of it. The Pharaoh then, exasperated, we might imagine, just says, okay, well, even if they are born, just throw them into the river. So the Pharaoh commanded all his people, throw into the Nile every boy that's born, but you may let the girls live. So this is a very harrowing, traumatic image from the animated movie Prince of Egypt. I have that little picture on the bottom left there, where Joseph goes into one of the halls of a temple, presumably, and sees inscribed on the wall an account of this program where they threw all of the male children into the river where the crocodiles were. And it's hard to imagine a crueler thing to do, to take somebody's baby from them and just throw it into the river and watch it sink, or watch the alligators or hippos eat it. You can only imagine the kind of grief and trauma that was incurred because of that. All right, so amidst this program of genocide, you had another act of civil disobedience other than Shiphrah and Puah, and that was the mother of Moses. We don't know her name, but we know that she was from the house of Levi. She was a Levite woman, and that she has a male child and doesn't let anybody know about it. She hides Moses for 3 months. We don't even know if Moses has a name at this point, even, just that it's a boy, that he's hidden. And when she can no longer hide him, she takes a papyrus basket, daubs it with bitumen and pitch, and puts the child in it, placing it among the reeds. So, two interesting things here. We have a basket daubed with bitumen and pitch, so tar, something to seal up the cracks. Where have we encountered that before, bitumen and pitch? Well, way back in Genesis with Noah's Ark, which was also sealed with bitumen and pitch. That alone might just be interesting coincidence, but if you look at the Hebrew word for ark, which is teba or taba, it's the same for the word used here to refer to the basket. Very interesting. And it's sad that this correspondence gets lost in the English translation. So it should read something like, she took a papyrus ark, daubed it with bitumen and pitch, and put the child in it, placing it among the reeds. So the descendants of Noah and all the animals he takes with him are saved from the water by the ark. And Moses here is saved from the waters of the Nile by floating in an ark. Very interesting. And also notice that he's placed among the reeds. That will also come back and have some significance. Placed among the reeds on the side of the river. And it's there that Pharaoh's daughter was bathing and notices this basket among the reeds. She goes over, opens it, and when she looks, she sees there's a baby boy crying. Here's really the first time we see in the Moses story anyway, the theme of crying, and it's from a little baby, from the most innocent person you could imagine. Babies cry spontaneously. They don't really think, process emotionally what they're doing. If they're in need, they just cry. So he's crying out because he's probably hungry or scared, cold even. And when she sees Moses, she's moved with pity. So we see here not only the theme of crying, but pity, response to the cries of this poor child. So she doesn't just ignore it and finish her bath. She's moved with pity. She sees that it's one of the Hebrew children. So she does something about it. She joins in the civil disobedience. Now, Pharaoh's daughter, she, if anyone, should follow through with Pharaoh's orders and just take the baby out and chuck him in the river, right? But she doesn't. She claims this baby for herself and then sends him back to the Hebrews. Moses' sister Miriam is lurking in the background among the reeds. She appears at a timely moment and says, do you want me to take this boy back and have one of the Hebrews nurse him for you? Now, I don't know exactly how he would have been marked or claimed as an Egyptian, but he's not thrown in the river now because he's officially Pharaoh's daughter's son, and the Hebrews are basically just serving as a nanny for it. And Moses' mother becomes his nursemaid and nurses Moses for him until he's able to join Pharaoh's household as the Pharaoh's daughter's son. And she names him Moses, for she said, I drew him out of the water. So this is the meaning of the name Moses. He's drawn out of the water, which has a rich significance both in terms of the story. The whole people are eventually drawn out of the water of the Red Sea. For Christians too, we see symbolic significance here to baptism. Every Christian who's baptized is placed in the water and drawn out of the water. So it becomes an identity marker of someone who has been saved, someone who has been redeemed from a threatening situation. Goes all the way back to Noah, really. Okay, Moses then grows up and does something very reminiscent of what Cain did way back in Genesis 4. Moses sees a Hebrew slave getting beaten by an Egyptian overseer, and he becomes angry and confronts the overseer and ends up killing him. And then he tries to hide the body in the sand. But when he encounters two Hebrew slaves after that fighting with each other, he tries to stop them, but they say, "What are you going to do? Kill us too?" So he realizes the word has gotten out that he has killed this Egyptian official. And before he can be hunted down by Pharaoh for his crime, he flees. In other words, he becomes a wanderer, which is exactly what happened to Cain, right? He becomes angry, he kills, and then he's forced to flee and become a wanderer. So Moses flees into this land called Midian, which is in the middle of the desert. Things do get better for Moses, but while things are getting better for him, they get even worse for the Hebrew slaves. Moses settles down in Midian, marries a woman named Zipporah, has a son named Gershom, and he's beginning to integrate into this new community. He becomes a shepherd and takes care of the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro. But while he's settling down, in chapter 2, we see that the Israelites groaned under their bondage and cried out. And from their bondage, their cry for help went up to God. God heard their moaning, and God was mindful of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and God knew. This is an extremely significant passage in the book of Exodus, because just like Moses was crying in the basket, the Israelites are crying out from their bondage. And just like Pharaoh's daughter regarded that cry with pity and responded to it with pity, God responds to the Israelite cries in the same way. God heard their moaning, was mindful of his covenant. He remembers that promise he made to Abraham, and he does something about it. So God introduces himself to Moses in a rather extraordinary way. And this is where chapter 3 begins. Moses is out tending the flocks of Jethro when the Lord appeared to him as fire flaming out of a bush, burning but unconsumed. So this strange preternatural sight confronts Moses. He sees this bush that seems to be on fire, but it's not burning up. So it's not a normal fire. He's intrigued by it. He goes over to look, and then he's addressed by God, "Moses, Moses." And he answers, just like Abraham answered Isaac, just like Abraham answered the angel in the story of the sacrifice, "Here I am, here I am." This is a formula that indicates a kind of openness, being disposed to what God wants to do. God says, "Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And it says Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So from this point then, after Moses is properly attired and his posture is appropriate for the occasion, God says, "I have witnessed the affliction of my people in Egypt and have heard their cry. So I know well what they are suffering. Therefore I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them up from that land into a good and spacious land, the land flowing with milk and honey." So he says, "I've witnessed," so I've seen what they're going through, I've heard, I know what they're suffering, and I have come down. So I am going to do something about it. And he says, "I'm sending you, Moses, to bring my people out of Egypt." Moses responds, "But what do I call you? What's your name?" If the Israelites ask, "Well, who sent you? Who is this God?" what do I tell them? And here's where God reveals his name, his holy name, which is probably the most revered, certainly the most revered title in the Jewish faith. It names, in a sense, the unnameable. He says, "Tell them, I am has sent you." First he replies, I am who I am, which is interesting because it's almost like at first a refusal to give a name, which is consistent with this angel that Jacob wrestles with. Remember, Jacob asked the angel, well, what's your name? Who are you? And the angel refuses to give a name. And that's how Jacob knows that this is really the Lord. Similarly, it seems as though the Lord is refusing to give his name here. But then that refusal itself becomes his name. Tell them I am has sent me to you. So this phrase, I am, this is where we get this, what's called the tetragrammaton, or the four-letter word, literally tetragrammaton. And it's transliterated as YHWH. This is God's name. This is his proper name, but it's kind of a anti-name name. It's a name that basically says, I am not one being as opposed to another. I'm not Bob instead of Fred, but I am. This is inclusive of all being. But he specifies it then as saying, I'm also the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. But he says that this name that I gave you, I am who I am, is my name forever, for all generations. So, in a sense, God is naming himself as that which cannot be named, the one who is. This is the traditional translation, at least in the Christian tradition. God is I am. He is the one who is. He's not a specific being in contradistinction to other beings. He is the being who is the very foundation of all being, inclusive of everything that is. Okay, so things get off to a rough start, though. Moses at first doesn't want to do the task God has given him. He says, but what if they don't listen to me? And Moses is given 3 signs, 2 at that very moment, and then 1 to be fulfilled later. First of all, God says, now take your staff and throw it on the ground. And so he does, and it becomes a snake. And God says, okay, now grab it by the tail. Moses does, and it turns back into a staff. So that was the first sign. Second sign is, now put your hand inside your cloak, take it out. Moses notices it's full of leprosy. His hand was covered with scales like snowflakes. This was meant to be a sign of leprosy. And then God says, we'll put it back in. He takes it out again, and it's normal, healthy skin. So that's the second sign. And the third sign God gives him is that when you free the Egyptians, you will come back and worship me on this mountain. So this is one that's going to be fulfilled in the future, but it's a promise. And he says, this mountain that you're at right now, you're going to see it again, but after you do what I ask you to do. This isn't good enough for Moses, though. He protests that he is slow of speech and tongue. And many interpreters think that Moses might have had a speech impediment, because to be slow of tongue is to be a stutterer. You can't get out the words. So some people have speculated that Moses may have had some sort of speech impediment. And understandably, he was hesitant to go down and to speak to the whole people. But the Lord responds to him, who gives one person speech? Who makes another mute or deaf, seeing or blind? I will assist you. So the Lord's basically saying, you'll have help. And you received the limited ability to speak from me. You receive the ability to speak in this capacity from me. I can do all things, pretty much. But Moses still says, no, send somebody else. So he's being very stubborn. He's being very hesitant here to accept the mission. And God finally compromises with him and appoints Aaron as his assistant, as his wingman, you might say. He says, I will give you Aaron. He'll be your assistant, and he will speak for you. You will speak to him and put the words in his mouth. I will assist both you and him in speaking and teach you both what you are to do. Now keep that in mind. Aaron is the second in command now. He's the assistant. He's the wingman, only because Moses was afraid to do it on his own. And this will come back to haunt Moses at the end of the whole story. All right. So first attempt to go and confront Pharaoh is a complete failure. They whiff on the first swing. It goes down like this. So Moses returns to Egypt. And on the way, God is prepping him. He's coaching him. He says, here's what I want you to say to Pharaoh. Israel is my firstborn son. And if you don't free my firstborn son, then I will kill your son. So these are the instructions that God's given to him. So keep that in mind. That's what God said to say to Pharaoh. What does Moses actually say to Pharaoh? Thus says the Lord, and there's the holy name. Thus says I am the God of Israel. Let my people go, that they may hold a feast for me in the wilderness. So this is not, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let my son go, that he may serve me. And if you refuse, I will kill your firstborn son. A bit sharper than, this God of ours wants us to go and have a feast or celebration for him in the wilderness. So could you kind of give us some days off? And it falls flat. Pharaoh's basically saying, well, who in the world are you? Who is this God you're talking about? I don't know you. I don't know this God. Your people are already too numerous, and here you are wanting to give them recreation, chance maybe to reproduce even more. So obviously they just don't have enough work on their hands. Even if they're thinking about doing this sort of thing, they're not beaten down enough. So I'm going to give them more work to do. From now on, you have to get your own straw to make the bricks. I can't go into detail about this part, but they make the bricks from straw and mud. The straw was provided for them. And Pharaoh is basically saying, okay, so you have to make the same number of bricks now, but you're not going to get the ingredients. You have to go make your own ingredients and get the straw on your own. And as you might guess, the people are not happy with him. They rise up against Moses. First, they complain to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, well, you're obviously not busy enough because you're worried about going out in the wilderness and having a party. According to this guy Pharaoh, who says he represents, or this guy Moses, who says he represents you. So then they turn on Moses. They assail Moses and Aaron. What have you done? Like, why have you meddled? And now our situation is much worse than it was before. And they're being whipped, punished more. You have made us offensive, they say to Moses and Aaron. You have put a sword into their hands to kill us. So they were afraid that there was no way out for them. They couldn't keep up with the quotas. They were being threatened physically. And so they thought, oh, we're all going to die because we can't keep up. So Moses then turns to the Lord. He cries out to God and says, what do I do? And it's here in chapter 6 that we get a moving account of the promises God makes to Moses. So they regroup here. And the Lord reaffirms his plan and his promises to Moses. He says, don't worry, do not fear. By a strong hand, Pharaoh will let the people go. And then he restates his name. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. And he has this interesting little phrase here. As God the Almighty, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but by my name, I did not make myself known to them. So you know me in a way that even Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not. So don't worry. You've been chosen, and you've received this special gift of knowing my name. I'm not going to abandon you. So he's building Moses back up, giving him more confidence in order to restart. And here is where he gives these 4 promises, which are known and revered in the Christian and Jewish faith, where he says, I've heard the groaning of the Israelites, and so I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their slavery. I will redeem you by my outstretched arm, and I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. And you will know that I, the Lord, am your God who has freed you from the burdens of the Egyptians. This is chapter 6, verses 6 through 7. These 4 promises of freedom, deliverance, redemption, and acceptance, or communion even, are the basis for the 4 cups of wine that are commemorated or that are drunk at the Passover meal, even to this day, as a remembrance of these specific promises, these expressions of God's intention to set the people free. So this is God's pep talk. And he even says, beginning of chapter 7, see, I have made you a God to Moses. Moses is complaining again about how he's a poor speaker. Pharaoh's not going to listen. The Israelites are not going to listen. And the Lord answers, look, you are going to be a God to him, which is very significant because Pharaoh himself was considered to be a God by the Egyptian people. So he's saying, though that guy that the Egyptians revere as a God, you are going to be a God to him, just as I am a God to you. So he's under you, and he will be in your power. Okay, so here's just a little slide about these 4 cups that are drunk at the Passover meal. You see at the top left there, 4 glasses of wine are incorporated into the Passover Seder meal. There's a specific prayer that you say while you hold the cup in your palm, like the guy is holding it on the bottom left there. And each cup is meant to commemorate one of these promises from Exodus 6. I will bring you out, I will rescue you, I will redeem you, and you will become my people, and I will be your God. Each of these cups has a specific name. And it's interesting that you drink an increasing amount of wine for the first 3. And then for the 4th cup, you don't drink because it's meant to be drunk only at the very last fulfillment of God's plan in history, where the people will become fully accepted and drawn into him. It's very interesting. Okay, so what ensues then between Moses and Pharaoh is a battle of gods, basically. The Egyptian pantheon, which is really structured around the Egyptian power system, and also the geography, the Nile, the fields of fertile ground where they grew lots of wheat. There's gods that are seeing over this whole structure, and the slaves are integrated into this, socioeconomically. And Moses is coming to overturn that structure. You might even call Exodus the book of revolution, because that's really what's going on here. Moses is coming along and is really challenging the system, challenging the power system of Egypt. And it starts with a snake battle. So Moses comes in, Pharaoh asks for a sign, why should I even listen to you? And Aaron throws down his staff and it becomes a serpent, becomes a snake. This takes on greater significance if you think about what snakes represent in Egypt. The crown of the Pharaoh, the Egyptian Pharaoh, had a snake on it, a cobra coming out of the top. And that was meant to signify Pharaoh's power. It's sort of like the scepter in Western kingdoms, the symbol that you wield the power. In Egypt, it was the snake on the throne of Pharaoh. So Aaron produces a snake. We might even think of it as a cobra. I think that would have been fitting. And this was a sort of a challenge. Like, you've got a little metal snake on your helmet. I'll produce the real thing right here with my staff. It was targeting his symbol or image of power, but the magicians of Egypt do the same thing. Who knows how, but they're able to turn their staffs into snakes as well. But Aaron's serpent consumes the others. And so again, this has the meaning that, the symbol of power produced by Aaron is greater than the symbols of power produced by the Egyptian magicians. It's a claim about preeminence. Pharaoh might have been a little bit bothered by this or disturbed by this. He might have felt a little unease because they were attacking his symbol of power. But instead of responding, maybe I should give way here, he hardened his heart. And it says he hardened his heart and would not listen. So in response to confrontation, Pharaoh locks down, you might say, and refuses to respond. refuses to acknowledge the challenge of what's going on, refuses to acknowledge the threat as the threat. And so then the plagues ensue. So there are these 10 plagues in all. And the first, well, before we get to the first plague, there's a general pattern of them all where Moses and Aaron come to the Pharaoh and say, let the people go, let go of these Israelite slaves. If you don't, then this plague will come. Pharaoh refuses, says he hardens his heart. And towards the end of the story, it even says the Lord hardened his heart, which is interesting. We could talk about that more maybe in our class, but Pharaoh refuses and the plague comes. That's the general pattern. Now, the first plague is the turning of the Nile into blood. See the picture there on the top left. The Nile was the source of life. It was the lifeblood of Egypt. It's where they got all their water. It's how they irrigated their fields. It's how they traveled. It was really the central geographic feature of Egypt. And that's what they attack first. But it also has meaning because it's where they threw the Hebrew babies. And that they turned it into blood kind of evokes all of the blood that was spilled in the Nile when they followed through with this plan of genocide, throwing the babies into the river. So in a sense, that first plague is the blood of these babies crying out from the waters. And as we've learned already a little bit, God hears the blood of those who are attacked unjustly or killed unjustly. So we see here that this is going to draw God's attention. It's already been drawn by the cries of the people, but the blood just further reiterates that. The blood of the babies crying out to the Lord. Each plague that ensues is an attack on a specific Egyptian god. So they had the god of the Nile. They have a god of the fields and the harvest. They have a god of the sun. And like many other ancient peoples, there's a specific deity assigned to a specific dimension of the natural world, and sometimes a dimension of the social world. And Yahweh is claiming his power and preeminence one by one over each of these major gods and each of these major dimensions of life in Egypt. So the magicians are able to replicate the first two plagues, but after that, they can't. So the first thing that happens is that the Egyptian magicians lose control over the ability to replicate these plagues, which was a way of diffusing. I mean, think of it in terms of propaganda. Right? If you're able to replicate what the Israelites are doing, you can always say it's just a trick, right? It's a hoax. It's not real. This threat isn't real. But once they stop being able to do that, they can no longer claim that this is just magic, sleight of hand. It becomes something much more real. Now, plagues 4 through 10 afflict only the Egyptians. So there's an increasing differentiation between the Egyptians and the Hebrews as the plagues go along. And at times, like after the fourth plague, for instance, the flies, Pharaoh seems to budge and say, okay, you can go out into the wilderness, and by the way, pray for me. But then when the plague goes away, when the threat goes away, he's back to his obstinate mentality, and he hardens his heart and reneges on his agreement. So eventually Pharaoh ends up in the same place no matter what. And as the plagues go along, there's more and more death. And finally, darkness. So here's a little chart that I thought I would put in the slides of all the different plagues. So you have the one for the babies attacking the very life source of Egypt. And then you have one coming from the sea, the frogs, one coming from the ground, the lice, and then one coming from the air, the flies. Then you have an attack on living things, like the attack on the livestock, attack on people's skin, the hail and fire coming from the air, attacking them. The locusts eat up all the food, and then finally the darkness comes, which is, in a sense, the most frightening of all. And but the death of the firstborn is definitely the most traumatic, and is what leads eventually to the Pharaoh sending the Israelites away. This is another chart. I won't explain all of this, but it's very interesting because it details the specific gods that were in charge of these various aspects of Egyptian life. So there was a specific god of the Nile, and Osiris was the bloodstream of the Nile. So the gods associated with the Nile are attacked by the Hebrew god. But one of the most striking ones, though, is the 9th plague, because the sun god, Ra, was the chief god, really, in Egypt. And it makes sense, right? I mean, the sun is like the most powerful thing out there. It's the thing that like sustains your life the most immediately, gives you light, gives you warmth, makes the food grow. And this god is claiming power even over that great chief god, Ra, by making everything dark, blotting out the sun. Blotting out the sun means like blotting out the sun god, right? And then finally, the death of the firstborn is really an attack on Pharaoh himself. But as I mentioned before, Pharaoh was considered to be the son of Ra, or a kind of god himself. All right, so on to then the Passover, which is really the preparation for, well, it's really a description of the last plague, the Passover, but it's from the Israelite perspective. So the Egyptian pantheon, even after the 9th plague is vanquished, because they've conquered the greatest god of all, Ra, and Pharaoh, being the son of Ra, is now under threat. So if you conquer the father, the son is threatened all the more. Pharaoh was kind of the earthly heir of Ra. Now notice that this was sort of a claim for or justification for his absolute power over Egypt. Oh, well, I am directly from God. I'm ruling as a representative from God himself. And when the gods that sent you and undergird your power are knocked away, then your power is called into question. And here is where you might recall that initial threat. The thing that God says to tell to Pharaoh from the very beginning in chapter 4, say to Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And since you refuse to let my son go, I will kill your son, your firstborn. And this last plague is where that threat is carried out. So here you have a kind of definitive final differentiation between the Hebrews and the Egyptians. The Lord explains the plan to Moses in chapter 11, giving detailed instructions about what the Hebrews are to do to survive this last plague. God himself is coming down and killing all the firstborn. But if the Hebrews take an unblemished lamb and sacrifice it and save the blood to put on their doors, then seeing the blood, I will pass over you, God says. So I will know that your house is one to be passed over, so the last plague will not affect you if you have that blood on your door. You are to dress for travel, gird up your loins, get ready to go. When you eat this meal, you have to eat it quickly, be ready to move. He says this will be a day of remembrance. So remember this day. This is going to be the first day on your calendar, the most significant day in your history. And for 7 days, you can only eat unleavened bread. Why unleavened bread? Well, to make leavened bread, or bread with yeast, takes more time. Right? You have to let the yeast sit in the bread so that it will rise. There's no time for that. We just have to make the bread without yeast, cook it right away. It's going to be flat, but that's okay because we got to be ready to go. And also do no work. In other words, have no other distractions. Be poised to move at any moment. And then, most significantly, apply the blood to the lintel of your house and the doorposts of your house. So this blood is sort of meant to mark your home as chosen for being passed over. And if your children ever ask you, why do we do these things each year? Because it is the Passover sacrifice for the Lord who passed over the houses of the Israelites. This is where we get that name Passover from, as it's when the Lord passes over the Israelite homes in the last plague. And it's the basis for the Jewish celebration of Passover, of course, and the Seder meal. So this meal begins to be outlined in chapter 12. I thought I would put a couple slides here about the Seder meal. I can't explain everything. We'll explain it later when it goes into even more detail. But even here you have the lamb bone which represents the lamb sacrifice in the last night of Egypt. And notice every part of this meal is meant to help you recall what happened in Egypt and how the Lord saved the people of Israel from Egypt. There's a more realistic picture of what it might look like. Passover plate with all the different elements representing all the different aspects of the Exodus experience. And then finally, the whole story, at least the first half of the book of Exodus, culminates in this victory at the Red Sea. So after the last plague comes and all the Egyptian firstborn die, even Pharaoh's son, Pharaoh orders the Israelites to leave. So it's not just, I'm letting you go. He says, go now. I want you out. And all the other Egyptians are freaking out, and they're thinking that everybody's going to die, not just the firstborn. Understandably, I mean, one person every household died. I mean, think of that. That would be extremely traumatic. So they're trying to get these Hebrews out of Egypt as fast as possible, and to send them on their way, they're giving them many gifts. And this is what's often called the despoiling of the Egyptians, because the Egyptians freely gave all this stuff to them and said, here you go, have a nice day, get out. So as to avoid any further suffering and death. The Lord gives Moses further instructions, the end of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13, again, to help them to remember what's going on so that they don't forget it and forget its significance. Here we see the beginning of these lists of laws or instructions that will characterize much of the rest of the Torah, but it's interweaved here with the narrative. And then finally you have the battles. So Pharaoh initially says to get out, but then he changes his mind. He says, you know what? No, I'm going to go after them, and they're going to get what for. So he's at first done with them, and he just gives up and surrenders, but he says, no, this cannot end this way. It's going to end on my terms. And so he goes out and chases them. There's this pillar, which is a kind of representation of the Lord's presence among them and his protection. It appears as a cloud by day and a fire by night, and it accompanies the people as they leave Egypt. Pharaoh gets his chariots, gets his army, and goes in pursuit. Now, when the Israelites see Pharaoh's army on the horizon, they freak out. And just like at the beginning of the whole story, when Moses comes and confronts Pharaoh, they rise up against Moses and Aaron. They said, what? Were there no graves in Egypt that we could be buried there? Why did you take us out all this way just so that we could die and be buried here? Like, what is all this for? Is this really how this is going to end? Because if so, it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth going all this way. We could have died in Egypt. Why are we out here to die? And better to live and be slaves than to meet our premature death right here at the edge of the Red Sea. So they were not happy, and they were regretting following Moses at that point. Now, here's where it's maybe important to mention that another way of translating the word for the Red Sea is the Sea of Reeds, or the Reed Sea. I think it literally means that in the Hebrew. And some people have said, oh, well, it wasn't really the Red Sea, like the Gulf of Aqaba. It was this pond, basically, which could have dried up, or wind could have blown the water away because it was so shallow. And there are reasons why that doesn't quite make complete sense. But that alternative title makes symbolic sense in a way. Because this sea, whose waters become walls, like huge towering walls on either side, so it can't really be a pond, harkens back to where Moses was drawn at the beginning of his life when he's a baby, right? Where did his mother place him? Where was he drawn from? The reeds. And I think this title for this body of water was meant to evoke that just as Moses was saved from the waters at the beginning of the story, so the whole people is saved from the Sea of Reeds here in Mas, much more dramatically. And it's the Lord who fights for them. So as he says this in chapter 14, the Lord will fight for you. Don't worry about fighting them. They probably didn't have weapons anyway. This pillar, which represents God's presence, moves behind them, so between the Israelites and the Egyptians, and they're given a little bit of cover so that then the Lord can send this wind Now, in Cecil DeMille's version of the story, it's Moses who whacks the water with his staff and then it parts. That's not what it really says in Exodus. It just says the Lord sends a wind to part the waters of the sea. And it's important to get that right because it's evocative of creation. How does creation get started in Genesis 1? Well, you have just water and the depths, and then a wind comes and blows over the water. And that's when you start to get the differentiation of light and darkness, of air and water, where things start to divide to create the world as we know it. So the Lord is creating again here. He's creating a people, but he's recreating, you might say, in a way, by blowing over the waters, a ruach, a wind, and the people go through it and are saved. The people pass through the waters, and then, of course, once the people are through, Pharaoh chases them into that water, and the waters close back over, and all of Pharaoh's army is drowned. And what ensues then is a great celebration. So the people have been saved. They're out of Egypt. They have escaped. Pharaoh's army has been destroyed, and they are astonished. I mean, talk about awe. An awe came upon them. This would be an awe-filled moment. They reflect upon it even there. The Israelites had walked on dry land through the midst of the sea. Like, what greater miracle could you have than that? Walk on dry land in the midst of the sea. Christians, of course, see here an image of Christ walking on the water. But at that time, remember, the Israelites are afraid of water. And to go through the water on dry land was just, unfathomable, unthinkable. It's the greatest of miracles. And when Israel saw the great power that the Lord had shown against Egypt, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and Moses, his servant. So you have this conversion, this sudden and complete conversion. They, even at the end there, when the Pharaoh was attacking them or about to attack them, they still didn't really believe in the Lord and the Moses. Why are we out here to die? Thanks a lot, but no thanks. But after they pass through the sea, there's no dissent left, no doubt or disbelief. They believe that the Lord really did this and that Moses really is his servant. And so they're on the same page now. The people are basically on the same page about what happened. And then chapter 15, you have this moving song where Moses and the Israelites sing in celebration for the victory. It's often called the Song of the Sea, and it's noteworthy because it's the oldest text in the Bible, so it's the most ancient passage of the Bible that we have. And its refrain, or the most famous line from it, is that the Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. But of course, that word, the Lord, there is really a title for the holy name. So Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. They're proclaiming the name of their God who has just saved them and reveling in it. And then Moses' sister Miriam, remember, who was there at the edge of the reeds to take Moses back to his mother, she responds to Moses and says, "Sing to the Lord, for he is gloriously triumphant. Horse and chariot he is cast into the sea." So the story comes full circle at the end. The story begins with the Israelite babies being cast into the water and ends with the Egyptian oppressors themselves being cast into the water. And there's ultimate justice and closure to this story, as we'll see here. But, of course, the drama isn't over yet, and we'll see there's much more to the story. So we'll pick up from chapter 16 onward and talk about that next time. And so that's all for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys